In fact, I'm quite keen to talk about organised crime because it's right up my street. Because I've long felt that central banking is probably the top tier organised crime, closely followed by government. Are they on the list?
Well, as quite a libertarian person, I would wholeheartedly agree that the biggest group of organised criminals are politicians. It has to be said at the start, of course.
Yes.
That the government is a mafia by other means, isn't it? In that they're extorting money, protection money, at threat of arrest.
Central bankers are just counterfeiters.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that's a bit disparaging to the mafia, actually.
Yeah,
now we have to start off with the preface: don't commit crime.
Yes.
And before,
and if you do, make sure you get away with it.
Disavow.
Yeah.
And leading on from that, at this point, having looked into the mafia, the organised crime families of the 20s and 30s with Bo in our Epochs and Lucky Luciano, and a bit of peripheral reading around the Yakuza, which I neither endorse nor disavow, considering I'm going to Japan next month, and that could be difficult. I would rather have a mafia than a police force at this point, because the police force at least pretend to be neutral and don't. The mafia are very particular and have often a code of honor about which criminal trades they will and won't partake in, and so they have some prohibitions which are morally better than most of the police force.
Well, and also they're people of a place. So our political class have become globalists, and they truly don't care to what extent they sell out the local communities. At least the traditional, organised crime boss, he's probably of that place, of that town. He's got deep roots into it. So yes, he might not be a nice guy. Yes, he's extracting cash, but he's probably ploughing some of it back into the community to at least some extent, and he actually cares about the nature of that community.
Yeah, that's what. Sorry, Connor.
They're a rooted investment class rather than the rootless billionaires who will go onto their yachts and St. Barts, and then rather than spend their money investing in upstart young men that could be the next generation of wealth creators, they'll spaff all of it on philanthropic ventures, aka lining the pockets of the NGO grievance industrial complex.
But to provide an example for what you're saying there, Dan, I think Pablo Escobar put millions and millions into Medellin, which is this sort of area that he was most associated with, and built loads of facilities and things, and supposedly had a tangible effect on the local area. And it made him a bit of a local hero, although, of course, I would argue he's a horrendous human being. I mean, that's not a difficult thing to argue, really, is it? He's blowing up aeroplanes and murdering people.
No, he's not a nice guy. But I mean, I was talking to a police contact of mine, and he was talking about his town, which I know reasonably well. Now, in that they've got a crew that came up through football hooliganism, had from that a large collection of guys who were prone to violence. Most of them can't do anything with them, but one or two of them had a bit of a brain on them, and they basically leveraged that, and they have become basically the richest people in this city. Where he's got to at this point is he's basically doing more for the local community than the council is. So he's buying up, rundown sections of the town, some of the iconic features of it, and doing it up and rehabilitating the place. Post-COVID, you'd expect to see a lot more pubs close, and they haven't. I mean, they're all money laundering fronts, of course. But basically, he's sort of keeping the character of the town together, and is doing more than the local government at this point.
That's something that Al Capone was doing when in Chicago. He was running for mayor, and then someone also directed him to the point that there were loads of kids suffering from malnutrition following the Great Depression. So he invested in making all of the schools provide milk. He put his own money into it so that loads of kids had freely accessible milk as they were going throughout their school day. This is something wholesome. And then something to that point as well. We have a proliferation of a new organised crime class in the UK with Albanian and North African gangs setting up Turkish barbers and counterfeit American sweet shops as fronts for drug trading. I've seen this happen myself, and there is a reason they all have brand new Mercedes and BMWs parked right outside. And so you're going to get some form of organised criminal trade, whether or not it's one that has ties to your time, place, and culture, or one you import is the question. I'd prefer the former rather than the latter.
That's something I've heard as well from my guy. Not the town that he's in now, but another place. In that, they got very active on chasing away the organised crime, and the organised crime they traced away was the homegrown variety. It was the British guys, because they kind of understood those networks and they knew how to get into them, so they targeted them and took them out. And all that happened is there was maybe a month lag, and then Albanians came in, and those guys haven't been touched because they don't have any route in to get into those networks, and so they've basically just got an entrenched Albanian class, which is far more violent and dangerous to the community than the British guys that they replaced.
Yeah, not all organised crime groups are created equal, really. Some are far more prone to violence than others. Like the Mexican cartels are probably a good example. Compare them to, say, some of the British organised criminals, and there was a sort of prohibition with British bank robbers that there was a time where if you had a gun on you, they wouldn't allow you to take part in the criminal act they're about to commit. Like they're just like, yeah, you're gonna get us in trouble, because I think at one point if you had a firearm, you might get the death penalty or something like that. Right. And so there was a practice of not using firearms for bank jobs because you didn't want to get the death penalty if you got caught. And so they actually actively enforced, yeah, you're not doing that. We're a bunch of organised guys. We don't need guns.
Flying below the radar.
Mm-hmm.
One of the great examples of this, there's two, particularly the Sicilian Mafia. After the RICO Act was brought in and broke those up, they went to the families became scattered, and as their influence waned, particularly with the prosecution of Gotti, and increasing immigration into the US, you're getting things like MS-13, which rather than being latently Catholic and buying into the American dream of entrepreneurship, they are just extracting resources from the area they don't feel tied to, and they literally worship the devil, so they have no prohibition on doing barbarous crimes. You have to commit rapes and murders in order to get into the gang and then tattoo your face. I mean, these people are barbarians.
Yeah, but that's interesting because they actually started off as being of a people. So it was the El Salvadorian expat community that was living in the US. I think it was them. They originally started to protect the El Salvadorian community. And basically, it just expanded. They started competing with some of the other existing gangs, and in order to survive, they just became more and more brutal until they became what you described, which is the sort of hell freaks that they are now.
Yeah, and it also depends on, and this is going to be incendiary to say, but the ethnic composition of the gang, as in where they have come from and what cultural prejudices they hold. The best example of that is the divide between the Yakuza and the Nigerian gangs now muscling in on Japan. The Yakuza, fairly racist, kept the Nigerians out who were doing human trafficking and drug peddling, something the Yakuza, because of their shogun, samurai, code of ethics holdover, they call themselves chivalrous organizations. They don't think of themselves as an organized crime family. They kept those trades out of their purview and out of the country. After the Japanese cracked down, there was an inter-family war that ended up getting uncharacteristically some civilian casualties. The Japanese have now made it illegal to do any overt business with a Yakuza-affiliated organization. You can't even display your Thieves Guild little shadow marks on the front of your clubs anymore. So they're entirely underground, and they've got about 3,000 members these days that we know of. The Nigerian gangs have started growing, even though Japan has relatively limited immigration. And so again, would you rather the homegrown ones, or the ones that are tied to time and place with the chivalric code, or the people that are just looking to get there while the going's good and don't have any prohibition against certain acts like violence, murder, and people smuggling?
I agree with the point you're making, but it is also worth mentioning the sort of premise that if the choice is crime or no crime, it's always no crime, right? But
yes. But the world doesn't work that way.
It doesn't work that way, yeah, exactly. And so it's better to incentivize as little crime as possible, and we will be getting on to how that can be done.
But there's also, I think, a key distinction in what classifies as crime, because there's the crimes of vice and there's the crimes of violence. And the crimes of vice are generally willing buyers and willing sellers, and I'm including within that drugs, most of prostitution, gambling, all that kind of stuff. And that tends to be a fairly arbitrary line. It's like alcohol is on one side of that line, where the government will say, we are going to subsidise it and support it, and we're going to, we're going to do these eat out to help out schemes to help the alcohol providers. But there's not really any. I don't think there's a massive difference between, say, alcohol and, say, cannabis. But that's on the other side of the line. Now, all of that kind of stuff, I think most people are relatively relaxed about it. I mean, for example, I found myself in a bar once, and the copper guy who was with me, he said, "Oh, that guy over there is a sort of the main coke dealer for this city," and I didn't feel a sense of revulsion from seeing him. I just thought, that's interesting. Keep an eye on him, but there was nothing visceral about it. Whereas if you had told me it was from the violent side, that guy is the chief kidnapper or child molester or human trafficker for the city, it would have stirred up an immediate visceral reaction. And I think we all sort of feel that there are these two sort of broad categories of crime, and we feel very differently about either one.
Mm-hmm. No, I wholeheartedly agree, and I think that there is a sort of arbitrary line, and I tend to hold the position of if two people are willingly engaging in a transaction, As long as there's not exploitation going on, then...
And I think the feminists understand that, because I mean, their whole thing with prostitution is to try and make it sound like 100% of it is human trafficking. Whereas a lot of the time, it's just some girl who can't be bothered to work in the supermarket.
Well, that's not true, though. That fundamentally... No. There is actually a major divide within the feminist camps who say that there is... so that's the sex positive, sex negatives. There was like an 80s, 90s internal schism, and that's revitalizing now with some of the women that I've spoken to on the podcast. What that comes down to, and this is why I would put prostitution in many cases more towards the violent camp, is that the settings under which consent is given, it's very blurry in terms of how much coercion is involved. Not just explicit human trafficking, but the kind of people that go into that trade have often had child abuse and the like. And they have an impaired ability to give quote-unquote informed consent. And so I would often put like drug abuse and the like. I don't think prohibitive laws... I'm not gung-ho for changing them, but I don't think they work. Like the war on drugs, it hasn't led to a full-on crackdown. Permissiveness also doesn't work either. But I don't think a culture of tolerance when you're selling literal human beings is a good idea. The same reason why, and I when we get onto which countries are doing what, I have some thoughts on what isn't showing up on the map that should also be classified as a crime.
Mm-hmm.
That would be very interesting as well.
I couldn't help but get triggered all the way through that on the basis you're talking about informed consent and selling people and all that kind of stuff. And it brings me back to where I started with this. It's bloody governments, and I'm particularly talking about the events of a couple of years ago that went on for 2 years. You talk about lack of consent, selling people.
Well, the pharmaceutical industry is a subsidized drug trade.
Yeah, and I mean, absolutely. I mean, you would be maybe slightly tongue-in-cheek, you prefer the mafia to government. I absolutely prefer the cartels to the pharmaceutical companies, because with the cartels, if you don't want it, they're not going to push it on you. I mean, if you get involved in the game, they're going to be brutal. If you get in the way, they're going to be brutal. But they're not knocking on your door saying you have to have this. Whereas the pharmaceutical companies did do that. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, they are the biggest criminals, which is why I just don't get as emotionally invested in the crime issue as perhaps the authorities would like us to.
Well, it would be kind of concerning if the cartels started using the government to leverage their own distribution, wouldn't it? And they're knocking on the door. Here's your compulsory cocaine.
Yes. Well,
I imagine there'd be parts of Britain that would really enjoy that.
Be quite popular, but yes.
I imagine London all of a sudden would be bursting with productivity.
Bristol would finally vote Tory.
Thank you for watching that clip from my series Contemplations. If you want to sign up to the website for £5 a month, you can access that series, which comes out 1 PM every Saturday. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.